I think we can officially start the event. So good evening, all. Really great to see you. Welcome all to this online event, which is the official launch of the Academy for Global Governance Innovators at the Center of Expertise on Global Governance at the Hague University of Applied Sciences TUAS. Good evening to those in The Hague and connecting from the Central European time zone, and good morning to those from the other side of the Atlantic, including our distinguished keynote speaker, Mr. David Boyd. My name is Barbara Varvas. I'm a professor in multi-level regulation and the director of the Center of Expertise on Global Governance at TUAS. The mission of our Center of Expertise is to increase the understanding by future professionals of how global governance works in practice. The Academy of Global Governance Innovators goes to the core of our mission. Through our academy, students will get an opportunity to work with practitioners and educators on the real challenges that global governance professionals face in their daily lives, so that students can propose their own solutions to those challenges. Students will thus have a unique chance to innovate the real world of global governance themselves. In this pilot edition of the Academy, we focus on youth participation in climate policies. Climate change is a global problem that couldn't be more urgent. At the same time, our research and discussions with students show that the youth is still underrepresented in the work on climate change, while increasingly calling for more involvement. In fact, the youth have always done the crucial hard work of protest from the outside of global governance institutions. The next step is to bring them in. Our partners for this edition are the Netherlands Youth Movement for Climate and the Center of Expertise for Global and Inclusive Learning in cooperation with Initiatives for Change. Our partners kindly prepared the assignment for students based on the puzzles they face in their daily practice. The students will learn about those assignments at the presentation from our partners next week. Hopefully, their work will be mutually beneficial for all those involved, and potentially it will also lead to new policy proposals for collective climate action. Here, I would like to thank our partners for their involvement in the Academy, and I really look forward to the results of our collaboration. For our launch today, we have a very special guest. I'm honored to introduce our keynote speaker for today, Sir David Boyd, who is the UN Special Rapporteur on Human Rights and the Environment. Mr. Boyd is also an Associate Professor of Law, Policy and Sustainability at the University of British Columbia. His career has included serving as the Executive Director of Eco-Justice, appearing before Supreme Court of Canada, and working as a Special Advisor on Sustainability for former Canadian Prime Minister Paul Martin. He has advised many governments on environmental, constitutional, and human rights policy and co-chaired Vancouver's effort to become the world's greenest city by 2020. He is a member of the World Commission on Environmental Law, an expert advisor for the UN's Harmony with Nature initiative, and a member of the Environmental Law Alliance worldwide. Mr. Boyd is also the author of 9 books and over 100 reports and articles on environmental law and policy, human rights, and constitutional law. Mr. Boyd, David, thank you very much for accepting the invitation to speak to our students today. We look forward to hearing more about your work, and I'm sure that your talk will be inspirational for their work within the Academy and beyond. The discussion after the keynote speech will be moderated by our colleague, Alana O'Malley, who holds a special chair in UN Studies in Peace and Justice, positioned within our Center of Expertise and the Faculty of Public Management, Law and Safety at TUAS, and the Institute of Security and Global Affairs of Leiden's University's Faculty of Governance and Global Affairs. The chair is funded by the municipality of The Hague as part of the Van Artsen Honors Program in honor of the work of the former mayor of The Hague, the city of peace and justice. Lastly, I would like to thank Dr. Tamara Takac, the coordinator of the Academy and senior researcher in our Center of Expertise, and all other colleagues in our center who organized this event and the Academy itself, including Maika Delor, Deborah Spinelli, Johanna Helsing, and Georgia Delgado. We are really grateful for your hard work. Thank you very much. We also invite the participants to ask their questions through the chat box. And the discussion will be based on your questions, and it will be moderated by Professor O'Malley after the keynote speech. So I think we are ready to go. And so let's proceed with our keynote speaker, or with the keynote speech by our distinguished guest, Mr. Boyd David. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much for that warm welcome, Barbara. And I'm delighted to be joining you today for the launch of the Academy for Global Governance Innovators. And I'm really delighted. I'm joining you from the traditional and unceded territory of the Coast Salish First Nations on the west coast of Canada. And you know, you've probably read about it in the media, but this summer, the west coast of Canada experienced an unprecedented heat wave. Temperatures setting records of 50 degrees Celsius, months of drought, massive wildfires, a town called Lytton that literally burned to the ground in a matter of minutes. This is compelling evidence of the climate emergency in which we find ourselves. Scientists estimate that that heat wave killed approximately 1 billion marine animals, illustrating the connection between the climate emergency and the biodiversity crisis. And the wildfires generated a massive amount of air pollution, leading Vancouver to have worse air quality for several days this summer than Delhi or Jakarta. Again, linking the climate crisis to the air pollution crisis that causes more than 7 million premature deaths every year. And so today, in the face of this global environmental crisis, what is the role of human rights? We know from events of recent centuries that human rights can be a powerful catalyst for transformative changes in society. Think of the way that the abolitionists used human rights to bring about the end of slavery, the way that women used human rights to increase their role in society and gain equality with men. The civil rights movement, the anti-apartheid movement, indigenous peoples have all used human rights to catalyze societal transformations. Now, human rights are not an instant, easy, or omnipotent solution to our environmental challenges, but history proves that rights can be powerful game changers. And one of the key strengths of a human rights-based approach is that there are institutions and processes that can provide accountability. So today, in my time with you, I want to share two critically important human rights ideas that young people can use and are using to tackle the climate and environmental crises. First, the right to a healthy environment, and second, the rights of the child. The right to a healthy environment is a powerful tool which has sparked transformative changes in a number of countries, ranging from Costa Rica to France. The 6 substantive elements of the right to a healthy environment include clean air, safe and sufficient water, healthy and sustainably produced food, a safe climate, healthy ecosystems and biodiversity, and a non-toxic environment where people can live, work, study, and play. And evidence from national experience where countries recognize this right is that it has been a catalyst for a number of key benefits, including stronger environmental laws and policies, improved implementation and enforcement of those laws and policies, greater levels of public participation, more access to information, and most importantly, the recognition of the right to a healthy environment is directly connected to improved environmental outcomes, including faster reductions in air pollution, faster reductions in greenhouse gas emissions, and a range of improved environmental metrics. This right to a safe, clean, healthy, and sustainable environment is already recognized in approximately 80% of the world's countries. We need to get that number up to 100%. And in my role as the UN Special Rapporteur, I have the privilege of working with the Children's Environmental Rights Initiative to gain recognition from the United Nations of the fact that every person, including every child on this planet, has the right to live in a healthy and sustainable environment. This right creates obligations for governments to take actions to respect, protect, and fulfill it. Actions including creating and enforcing air quality standards, creating protected areas and conserving endangered species, phasing out toxic chemicals, including pesticides, ensuring safe drinking water, and many, many more. 2 weeks ago, young people from around the world presented me with a petition they called My Planet, My Rights. They had gathered over 150,000 signatures calling for the UN to recognize their right to live in a healthy and sustainable environment. And thanks in part to this powerful advocacy from young people, the UN Human Rights Council this week is debating a resolution that would recognize this right at the global level for the first time. So young people are taking action, are pushing forward their right to a healthy environment. Turning to the rights of the child, these rights are set forth in the Convention on the Rights of the Child and include the rights to life, health, education, an adequate standard of living, and more. Freedom of association, freedom of expression. One of my favorite parts of the right to education under the Convention on the Rights of the Child is that every child has the right to development of respect for the natural environment. And I love this because really every child and young person that I meet in my work already knows more about protecting and respecting the natural environment than many of the adults that I meet. There is a troubling gap in the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child because, like all of the other global human rights treaties, it does not explicitly include the right to live in a healthy and sustainable environment. However, it does say in Article 3 that in all actions concerning children, the best interests of the child shall be a primary consideration. So I want you to just take a moment to imagine a world where the right to a healthy and sustainable environment and the best interests of children were taken seriously. This would be a world where fossil fuels were phased out and deforestation was reversed. It would be a world powered entirely by clean, renewable energy, accessible to everyone. It would be a world without pervasive indoor and outdoor air pollution and without ubiquitous toxic substances harming children's health. It would be a world where biodiversity and ecosystems flourished both on land and in water, providing irreplaceable benefits to children, from clean water to nutritious foods to places to play outdoors in natural settings. It would be a world where no child went to bed hungry, no girl endured the pain of discrimination, and no child suffered from extreme poverty. It would be a world where every child went to school, had access to healthcare, had economic opportunities. In short, it would be a world where the gap between rich and poor was less like the Grand Canyon and more like a minor difference. So what we've just imagined is actually very close to the 17 Sustainable Development Goals that the world is aiming to achieve by 2030. If successful, we will have transformed our societies in remarkably just and sustainable ways. It's an inspiring, beautiful, and powerful vision, but I have to be candid with you. We're not on track to achieve all of the UN Sustainable Development Goals. And I believe that failure is not an option. Failure would be a devastating indictment of our indifference about the rights of children and about the right to a healthy environment. So many millions of people, including young people around the world, are working hard to make the vision of the Sustainable Development Goals a reality. And this includes millions of young people and children. And I have to admit, this is my favorite part of serving as the UN Special Rapporteur. I get the opportunity to meet children from every region of the world, and they are consistently amazing. So many of them care deeply about the environment and social justice. I've met young people from Russia who risked arrest so that they could participate in the Fridays for the Future climate movement. And what an amazing social movement that is. Initiated by young people, driven by young people, sidelined to some extent by the pandemic. But I guarantee you, as the pandemic subsides, that movement will come back stronger than ever. And in fact, tomorrow is the global climate strike, and I'll be participating with my 15-year-old daughter in Victoria here in British Columbia. In my first official country visit as the UN Special Rapporteur, I went to Fiji, and UNICEF very kindly organized an event where I got to spend a couple of hours just chatting with a couple dozen youth from Fiji. And I'll never forget talking to a 12-year-old girl named Akira, who said that she used to go to the beach every Sunday with her family for a picnic after church, but she doesn't go anymore because, in her words, the ocean seems angry. And it was heartbreaking to hear from these beautiful Fijian children their fears for their future. And so That is one of the reasons why I made a commitment to those Fijian children, to children and youth every time I meet them, that I will use my position to amplify their voices and to expand their opportunities to engage in these critical debates at the global level. So I'm working, as I mentioned earlier, with the UN, with the Children's Environmental Rights Initiative, and we've been hosting a series of regional consultations to hear directly from children and young people about their visions, their goals, their hopes, their aspirations, and the paths forward that they see. At our first session in Bogota, Colombia 2 years ago, I met about 100 children and youth from Latin America and the Caribbean, working to defend what they described as their territories of life from environmental degradation. Those territories of life, of course, upon which their culture and their livelihoods depend. And their knowledge, their passion, and their eloquence was completely inspiring. I said to them, you are not only the leaders of tomorrow, you are the leaders of today. I've met children around the world who are doing things such as installing solar panels on the roofs of their schools, raising the money, doing the research, even helping with the installation. I recently met a group of young people from Scotland who are part of the Scottish National Children's Parliament. They set up a special committee to generate ideas about addressing climate change, and they presented those ideas to the adult Scottish Parliament. I've met young people running for office, young people running small businesses based on just and sustainable ideas. I've met young people who are inventing apps, for example, to reduce food waste. I'm supporting the World Youth for Climate Justice, who are a group of young people in the South Pacific who are trying to convince the United Nations to hear a case before the International Court of Justice on what states must do to address the climate emergency. And also, because of the advocacy of children, and thanks to my predecessor, John Knox, and the work done by the Children's Environmental Rights Initiative, the UN's Committee on the Rights of the Child has recently announced that it will publish a new general comment on children's rights, the environment, and climate change. And these general comments are actually very influential documents that shape the future of international human rights law by providing expert guidance on the interpretation and implementation of the Convention on the Rights of the Child. And children and young people are going to be at the heart of drafting this new general comment. So all of this is, to me, incredibly inspiring, but it's also somewhat embarrassing, because what are the adults doing? Our political leaders, our business leaders, our social leaders, even our academic leaders. Not only are we not doing enough, but many adults are continuing to make a bad situation worse. For example, in the face of a global climate emergency, the world's wealthiest countries, Norway, Canada, and the United States, are continuing to explore for more oil and gas reserves, when the science is crystal clear. We can't even burn the reserves that we have. The richest 1% of people, adults, live lifestyles that are so disgraceful in their hyperconsumptive excess. They have carbon footprints that are literally thousands of times higher than the poorest half of humanity. Young people understand this. In the world-leading nation of Costa Rica that I mentioned earlier, the government is currently considering legislation that would permanently ban all oil and gas exploration and development. Costa Rica has already banned open pit mining and gets virtually all of its electricity from renewable sources, including solar, wind, geothermal, and hydroelectric. According to my friend Carlos Manuel Rodriguez, who's the former environment minister of Costa Rica, there was a recent public opinion poll that found 49% of people support this legislation to ban fossil fuel exploration and development. 44% oppose it, obviously for economic reasons. But among young people under the age of 35, 92% support this ban on oil and gas exploration and development. It is their future that is threatened by the global climate crisis. And so, ladies and gentlemen, it is a crazy world where children and youth have to sue their own governments to try and protect their rights from being violated by the climate emergency. And yet that's exactly what is happening around the world. A few months ago, a successful case in Germany where the Constitutional Court ordered the German government to adopt more ambitious targets and accelerate the pace of climate action. And within weeks, Germany had agreed to cut emissions 65% by 2030 and speed up its target for getting to net zero. A successful case in Colombia, where 25 children and youth, many of whom I met when I was in Bogota, these incredible young people, they brought a case to the country's Supreme Court based on their right to a healthy environment, arguing that deforestation in the Colombian portion of the Amazon rainforest was a violation of their rights. And the court agreed and ordered the government to bring together scientists, government agencies, and children to flesh out a plan to end deforestation in the Amazon. A successful case in Australia, where a judge warned the government about the devastating consequences of further coal expansion on children's rights, essentially saying to the government, you better not try to approve any new coal mines. Other successes in India, Pakistan, other countries. Of course, not all cases are successful. Children and youth have lost legal challenges in Canada and the United States. But the trend is clear. And there are also fascinating cases happening at the global level. There's a case at the European Court of Human Rights where a group of 6 children and youth from Portugal have filed a lawsuit against 33 European countries, asserting that heat waves, wildfires, and smoke from those wildfires, all of which are exacerbated by climate change, violate their human rights, and that governments in Europe have failed to adequately protect them. The European Court of Human Rights not only accepted this case for consideration, but gave it priority status so that its decision will be expedited. And there's a similar case before the UN Committee on the Rights of the Child, brought by Greta Thunberg and 15 other children from all over the world against Argentina, Brazil, France, Germany, and Turkey. And these young people are also arguing that their rights as children are being violated by government inaction in the face of the climate emergency. Their rights to life, their right to health, and cultural rights. And again, wearing my hat as the Special Rapporteur, I've been able to file what are called amicus briefs or friend of the court briefs in both of these international cases because of that commitment I made to children back in Bogota in 2019, where I said, I will do everything within my power as Special Rapporteur to support you and to amplify your voices. So, my friends, children and youth will keep on marching and protesting and suing until adults take the actions necessary to respect, protect, and fulfill their rights. They'll keep inventing and innovating and advocating because their future depends on rapid, systemic, and transformative change. And so I urge all adults who believe in the rights of the child and who believe in the right to a healthy environment to listen to young people, to act on their demands, to amplify their voices. Doing so is really the best chance we all have for achieving a just, healthy, and sustainable future. Thank you very much for your time today, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you so much, Professor Boyd. That was really a fascinating tour de force of a call to arms, but also an overview of the connection between youth and also between the climate crisis and what has been done so far and what we need to do. I wrote down a list of questions actually while I was listening to you. So as I wait for our audience to gather their thoughts, and please, if you have any questions, then please do use the Q&A button. It's just located to the right of the screen. As I wait for them to gather their thoughts and to raise some questions, I'm going to jump in and take the lead and ask some of the questions that I was thinking about. Maybe just something kind of quite quite obvious to begin with. I mean, you talked a lot about how young people are taking cases, putting this emphasis on litigation and on law and taking states to international courts to make them answerable for their failure to meet targets. And you talked about, I think, very clearly about how your office facilitates that process. I wanted to ask you, is there a danger there in the UN providing this kind of middle avenue between it's a direct voice for youth to the UN, to your office, and to many others. I mean, I'm thinking also of the Secretary General's Envoy on Youth. I mean, this is a direct avenue. So is there a danger that you're kind of bypassing the member state level? And in fact, in this way, young people are able to use UN mechanisms to confront member states with the problems of climate change and also to hold them accountable. And I mean, this is very good for the cause of climate change, but is this a problem in terms of the adaptability, in terms of interpreting some of the UN's functions and responsibilities in ways in which were not originally intended?
Oh, that's a great question, Alana. And I personally don't see a problem. I actually think that litigation is very much a last ditch. It's the last thing that you do. It's very difficult. It's time consuming. It's expensive. But you have to recognize that, the governments of the world got together in 1992, so almost 30 years ago, and made a solemn commitment to, and this is a direct quote from the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, to avoid dangerous anthropogenic interference with the Earth's climate system. And so for 29 years, young people, scientists, human rights activists, environmental activists have done everything in their limited power to convince governments to take action to confront the climate crisis, to pass the legislation required, to make the investments in renewable energy that are necessary, to transform transportation systems, electricity systems, food production systems. And governments over the past 30 years have simply not acted with the degree of urgency that is required to meet this crisis. We are currently on track for somewhere between 3 and 4 degrees of temperature increase. And look at the climate impacts that we're already experiencing at 1.1 degrees of global warming. And so children and young people are turning to the courts in a desperate effort, I would say, to attempt to hold their governments accountable to the commitments that they made 29 years ago. And so I don't see it as problematic that I'm using my office to assist children in that effort. I think that we actually need all societal institutions to engage with this. Litigation is not the optimal solution. What we should really be doing is just focusing on the solutions to these problems and implementing the solutions. But if governments aren't going to implement those solutions voluntarily, then litigation represents a very powerful way of compelling them to meet their human rights and environmental commitments.
I think you're absolutely right, and I think it's quite inventive that you see this expansion of the UN's capacities in terms of providing further agency for you to kind of hold states accountable on these issues. I think that's entirely the way that the UN system should operate. So that there always are these critics who say, no, it should be the member states who devise and decide everything. But you're entirely right, and you've pointed to their failings actually in meeting their own targets. So this, I think we can certainly share an interpretation of how the UN works. Let me just ask you one more question, and we can see the Q&A loading up now. But I just wanted to get this in under the wire. So, of course, we are always interested in looking for ways in which young people can expand their agency. And I think that sometimes there's, as much as there are some fantastic global efforts like Fridays for Future, what Greta Thunberg has done, and what young local activists have done all over the world, there's also this sense that we're really throwing pebbles at a mountain when we think of, as you rightly mentioned, the role of larger states continuing to explore for oil and gas, but also the role of corporations. Can you say something about, somehow that balance between the frustration of young people on the one hand who feel that their local efforts are only a stone's throw in terms of what the climate change effort can achieve when we continue to allow corporations to act essentially without impunity on these issues, or with impunity, sorry.
Right. Yeah. So that is a tough question, Alana. And the first thing I'll say is that every action in the right direction matters. I mean, the collective actions of millions, and indeed what we need, billions of people moving incrementally towards a more just and sustainable future, that all makes a difference. And I think that nobody should be discouraged. For example, as I said, I've worked with young people who have convinced their schools to put solar panels on the roofs of their schools so that the schools are using renewable energy instead of fossil fuel energy. That kind of action makes a tangible difference. And as the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change has said, every single reduction of greenhouse gas emissions makes a difference towards holding us within a limited global impacts of climate change. So I really want to encourage people to take every action they can. Not everybody can do everything. Local action's important, regional action's important, global action, they're all important. And I think if everyone was pushing in the right direction, we would move forward quite quickly, as a matter of fact. The second issue that you raised, the role of corporations, is really a vexing one. And in my term thus far as the Special Rapporteur, I have focused my efforts on governments because I believe that governments actually have obligations to regulate corporate activities. And there are some quite promising signs in that field. And I'll just mention two very quickly. One is that A growing number of governments are passing laws that require corporations to do what's called human rights and environmental due diligence, not just in the countries where they're based, but throughout their entire supply chains. And so France was a pioneer in this regard in 2019. The European Union is considering similar legislation, but we definitely need stronger laws to ensure that corporations respect human rights and protect the environment. There's something called the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights from 2011, which are really a nice set of voluntary guidelines on how businesses should behave. But the reality is that the great majority of companies around the world will only do what is required of them and won't go beyond those, and in some cases won't even comply with the legal requirements, let alone these voluntary requirements. So there's also an initiative underway to develop a legally binding treaty on transnational corporations, which is actually moving forward, moving ahead through a UN process. So yeah, and I will also say that there are a small number of businesses which are actually behaving in socially and environmentally responsible fashion. A group of those businesses, approximately 50 businesses, just signed quite a powerful statement calling for the United Nations to recognize the right to a healthy environment. So they're standing up alongside young people and civil society and scientists and saying, we need to recognize this fundamental human right because it has powerful potential for pushing us in the right direction.
Terrific. Well, I think you and I could talk all day, but I don't want to stand in the way of our audience. And now the Q&A is absolutely filled up. So I'm going to start with this question from Aaron Bangudi. And he asks, how do you think that the Africans have to cope with climate change? A large part of the population there is dependent on agriculture, but due to poverty, there's a lack of resilience on how to cope with techniques and ability to cope with droughts, and governments who are more focused on the export of products like oil, gold, cobalt, etc.
Yeah, the challenge of sustainable development in Africa is a huge challenge. And the impacts of climate change, as the question suggests, are already being disproportionately felt in Africa. I was in Kenya 2 years ago, and I met with some pastoralists who told me in very emotional terms that they have lost most of their livestock because the land where they have traditionally taken those animals for grazing just can no longer sustain those animals. And so I think that when we talk about Africa and climate change, there's a couple of things. One is that the majority of people in Africa are still living in conditions of extreme poverty. And so there needs to be economic development in Africa. There needs to be resource development, but it needs to be done in a sustainable way. Right now in Africa, a lot of the electricity that people use is generated by burning fossil fuels at a cost which is actually much higher than sources of renewable energy. So there's tremendous potential in Africa for renewable energy to bypass the kind of fossil fuel development that has happened everywhere else. The second thing I'll say about Africa is that countries in the global north have an obligation to Africa. Africa has been the source of wealth that's been extracted without benefits to the local people and communities, extracted by corporations and people in the global north. So, 40 years ago, there was a Canadian prime minister who said that all wealthy nations should provide at least 0.7% of their global domestic product to budgets for foreign aid or what's called official development assistance. Very few wealthy countries have ever met that commitment. The Scandinavians, to their credit, Finland, Denmark, Sweden, and Norway do consistently meet and exceed that target. And if other countries like Canada and the United States, the United Kingdom, and France also met that target, that could give a real helping hand to Africa. In the particular context of climate change, there was something that was included in the initial conversations 30 years ago when the Framework Convention on Climate Change was being developed, called loss and damages. So we had mitigation, reducing emissions and protecting carbon sinks, adaptation, preparing for climate impacts, and loss and damage was intended to be a source of financial resources for the small island developing states and the world's least developed countries to assist them with the impacts of climate change. So for example, these Caribbean nations that are being hit by repeated hurricanes that damage 90% of the buildings, they simply can't pay for the reconstruction. And so this concept of loss and damages, which I think is a very compelling concept, has been discussed ad nauseum at conferences of the parties to the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change since 1992. And here we are in 2021, not a single dollar, not a single euro has changed hands under this loss and damages program. And so, you know, some of these small island developing states have put forward proposals for an air passenger travel levy and for a shipping levy that would target industries that are kind of outside current climate regulation and could raise tens of billions of dollars every year that could be used by these countries. So I think there's a number of things that need to be done to address the challenges in Africa, but it's going to require a greater level of generosity and fulfilling our moral and ethical obligations as wealthy states in order to assist Africa in doing that. And there's some amazing programs. I just want to mention one last thing. There's a program in Africa called the Great Green Wall, which involves 21 countries from Senegal on the west coast to Djibouti on the east coast. And what it is, it's a massive program to restore degraded land and to reverse desertification. And they are planting literally millions and millions of trees every year. They're restoring agricultural land. They've already planted hundreds of millions of trees and restored millions of hectares of land, producing food. There's a solar electricity component of the Great Green Wall project, and it's an absolutely amazing African-led initiative that's protecting the environment, restoring the environment, protecting human rights, creating economic opportunities. And I believe that's the kind of big picture, big vision programs that can really help bring Africa up to speed with the rest of us.
Terrific. You've given us loads of ideas there. I'm going to put two questions together here from Alessandra Cow and Gamira. Alessandra's asking about whether or not it will be likely or possible that not only governments get brought before the international courts, but also multinationals, like corporations, as we mentioned earlier. And Gamira also asked along similar lines about whether or not it's possible to have greater or stronger enforcement mechanisms at the UN level that are indeed targeted again at private actors or profiteers who really, you know, are not members of multilateral treaties. So how do we get these really big players into that multilateral framework for accountability?
Yeah, those are good questions, and I have to confess, it's extremely tricky. So the international human rights treaties that exist create obligations for states, but they do not create obligations for businesses. And so it's really not at this present time possible to bring lawsuits under these UN treaties against businesses. In my role as Special Rapporteur and the special procedures generally, we can receive complaints from citizens and communities that their rights are being violated. And those complaints can address activities or actions by both governments and corporations. So for example, I've been involved in a situation in Colombia in South America where a group of indigenous people sent a letter to me saying that they live directly next door to one of the world's largest open pit coal mines, a coal mine that has caused extensive air pollution, water pollution, destruction of their ability to grow their own food. And this coal mine is being operated by a number of large multinational corporations. And so I wrote a letter both to those corporations and the government of Colombia saying, can you please explain the actions that you're taking to address these allegations? And although I don't have any power as the Special Rapporteur to order the government or order the corporations to take activities, this created a firestorm of controversy in Colombia that the United Nations was telling Colombia and these companies that they should close down part of this mine in order to address the problems that are confronting these indigenous people. So there are mechanisms where corporations can be at least have a spotlight shone on their activities, but you know, the question of whether any type of UN mechanism will ever have the power to actually require certain behaviors from corporations. I wish that were the case, but I realistically, we're very far from that today. And the treaty that I mentioned, which is a treaty, a UN process to develop a treaty to regulate transnational corporations and their impacts on human rights, that treaty is focused exclusively at this time in its draft provisions on requiring governments to put in place regulatory frameworks that hold corporations accountable. So there's no direct accountability to the corporations themselves. It's through the intermediary of governments. And that's, in terms of human rights, the UN kind of sets the standards through these treaties, but and does have some processes to hold governments accountable. But the reality is that the overwhelming action on human rights and the environment takes place at the national level.
Yeah, I mean, it's very true what you say, but I think it's interesting also that we see UN criticism of individual member states matters more and more. I mean, we've seen the role of rapporteurs be so important in that, on human rights, but also on other issues. So it'd be very interesting in future years to see how offices like yours extend their authority in that regard, and really confront states with their obligations. And I think that's an incredibly interesting role for the UN that perhaps in past years it was not as effective with. Let me ask you a slightly more abstract question from my colleague at Leiden, Jan Schulte. And he asks, are there tensions or even contradictions between human rights and the rights of nature?
Yes. Okay. This is a question I get quite often because I've written books about the right to a healthy environment and books about the rights of nature. Mostly today we've been talking about the human right to live in a healthy environment, and there's a concept which actually has deep roots in indigenous cultures, which is this concept of the rights of nature herself. And so, as I said, thousands of years of history in indigenous legal systems really began to get more attention globally in terms of modern legal systems in 2008, when Ecuador developed a new constitution that includes the rights of what they call Pachamama, or Mother Earth. And then Bolivia passed a law in 2010 called the Law on the Rights of Mother Earth. And there have been developments in Mexico, Uganda, India, Bangladesh, a growing number of countries recognize, and New Zealand, importantly, recognizing that ecosystems and rivers, mountains can be assigned legal rights. So, in much the way that we recognize through our law, through our legal system, the rights of corporations, we can also recognize the rights of nature. So in New Zealand, for example, they have passed one law granting rights to a river, another law granting rights to an ecosystem of mountains, forests, and lakes. Is there a contradiction between these two things? Hypothetically, the answer is there could be in some circumstances. So, for example, if you imagine a country that is facing drought and has a limited water supply, you could envision a potential tension between the rights of the river to have enough water for a healthy functioning ecosystem and people's rights to have water for their basic needs and for growing food. But at this point, those tensions remain largely hypothetical. And in fact, I actually believe there are terrific synergies between the rights of nature and the human right to a healthy environment. And we're seeing in Latin America a really fascinating development where the human right to a healthy environment is being interpreted as having two facets: healthy in terms of human health and well-being, but also healthy in terms of ecological health and well-being. So there's some absolutely phenomenal court decisions from countries including Colombia, Mexico, that are taking the human right to a healthy environment and are holding governments and businesses accountable, for both facets of that right, for its human aspects and also for nature itself. And that includes a really powerful decision from the Inter-American Court of Human Rights from 2017, which said that the right to a healthy environment includes rights of rivers, oceans, forests, and other natural entities. So it's an area of the law that's really fascinating and is having tangible impacts, particularly in the Latin American region.
Terrific. Let me ask you another question from a slightly different angle. And that comes from my colleague at TUAS, who's Rosa Green, and she's asking, how do we include teaching our children in our teaching work on these issues? And how do we inspire children and young people to really take up the baton of climate change? Because obviously, with this group, you're preaching to a choir of people who are already interested and motivated by these questions. But how do we spread the word further? And how do we use our teaching and research to do that? And how do you do it in your role as rapporteur?
Well, this is a big challenge. I really do think that where we are at in the year 2021 is we should recognize that an ecological education is just as important as learning to read, learning to write, and learning math. I mean, we've reached that point where it's that critical to our future survival that all children from kindergarten through grades 1 through 12 and into college and university. Sustainability and ecological education should be at the heart of all of our education systems. You know, right now we have such a siloed system where, you know, maybe children are taught an environment unit in social studies, maybe in university, some students receive training in sustainability, but really all students need that. And so it should be written into the heart, into the DNA of our education system, ecological education. That's the first thing that I would say. And I really, you know, the thing, maybe I'm meeting a certain subset of young people around the world, but my sense is that based on my travels and the young people I meet, that they all do actually, you know, children definitely, when they're young, they love the natural world. And so it's really one of the things we have to do is make sure not only that they have the education, but they also have the opportunity to experience nature firsthand, because there's lots of scientific evidence that that is a critical part of being ecologically responsible adults, is building a relationship with nature through childhood.
Let me just ask you a question about that, about your, I think you're absolutely right. I think that young people, they're ahead of adults on this message. And of course, they're far more inventive in terms of the ways in which to put this, take on this challenge than most adults are. But we saw in the Secretary General's recent report, Our Common Agenda, a huge emphasis on climate change, and in fact, a parallel emphasis on young people and on youth agency. And one of the concrete proposals in that report is to create an envoy for youth in general, but specifically what he calls a future generations envoy. And I think a large part of that role would be generated towards climate change. Now, I mean, you know, I think the question that a lot of young people have also about their agency is, you know, to what extent is it performative agency at the diplomatic level where they can go and give very eloquent speeches and be heard? And what happens after that? So what could we expect from this new role? I mean, to what extent is this UN embrace of youth agency very concrete in the substantive policy proposals and pressure on member states that they're trying to generate around climate change?
Well, you know, I can't speak for the UN as a whole. I can really only speak for my own experience. And my own experience is that there is actually a degree of frustration among young people, which I completely understand and empathize with, that they're being given platforms, but they're not yet being heard. So it's one thing to say children have the right to express themselves, but we also have to ensure that their voices are actually heard and acted upon. And so I think that this is actually this is the critical thing. So what are the actual steps we can take to ensure that children actually have more power? So I think, you know, there's a number of countries that have actually lowered the voting age, which I think is a very powerful thing. I know I have a 15-year-old daughter. We just had a federal election in Canada. She followed it more closely than most adults and was furious that she didn't have the opportunity to vote. You know, as she says to me, "Papa, I'm 15. My whole future depends on this election. People who are 80 or 90, you know, it doesn't matter to them." So I think that's one really important thing. I've had experiences with children who are participating in national children's parliaments, and I think that's a really innovative kind of structural approach, that if you establish a serious institution like a national children's parliament that interacts with the adult parliament, that's a way that children's voices can be heard, particularly the examples of Scotland and France and Guyana. And so there, and then, well, I was in Norway as well on a country mission a couple of years ago, and Norway has made amendments to some of its planning laws to require children and youth to be part of planning bodies. So not just having the right to, you know, participate in planning process, but actually having a seat at the table. And so I think those kinds of innovations are critically important. I do think there are also institutional innovations. You know, Hungary has had a commissioner for future generations. Finland has a parliamentary committee on the future. And so I think that what we really need to do is institutionalize young people in these processes in order that they actually have political power to directly influence government decision making.
Terrific. Yeah. Let me just ask you now about the other end of the scale, and that's a question from Stein. And he's asking, what's your opinion on the ongoing and terrible trend of the killing of climate activists? Do you see this trend continuing? And he says it makes him feel less safe going out to marches, even though these killings perhaps don't happen in his own country.
Yeah, this is really a terribly disturbing trend. It's a trend that's of human rights activists in general globally being subjected to increasing levels of harassment, intimidation, violence, criminalization, and even in extreme cases, murders. And so there's definitely a high level of concern about this in the civil society and at the United Nations. There are definitely hotspots. You know, Colombia, the Philippines, Mexico, our country, and Brazil are countries where, you know, according to the latest reports from Global Witness, these are the places where where there are a lot of murders taking place. And so there are processes, programs. There's a lot of people trying to address this. For example, in under the Aarhus Convention, which is a regional treaty covering 47 countries in Europe and Western Asia, they're creating a new special mechanism that will enable people to directly access help when they feel like their safety is being jeopardized in the context of their environmental activism. That's one mechanism. The UN Human Rights Council has passed recently a resolution on environmental human rights defenders, outlining the obligations of states to take actions to protect people from those types of threats of violence, but also to create safe spaces. And this is one thing where I think we really need to push back. You know, in a lot of countries in the recent years, there has been a shrinking of civic space. In my role, I heard recently from people in Cambodia and Thailand about just how difficult it is becoming, that countries are cracking down on civil society organizations, which, you know, are the lifeblood of democracy. In Uganda, they're cracking down on civil society organizations because they've been speaking out against a major pipeline project. And so, you know, when the government is itself not supporting civil society, then it's really empowering those forces of darkness that are willing to act with violence and do these terrible deeds. And so it's a real severe problem. And because these people really should be viewed as heroes for society and heroes for planet, because they're often in a volunteer capacity, putting themselves at risk by speaking up for the land, speaking out on behalf of water and biodiversity and climate change. So we definitely need to do more to protect them. And I believe there's strength in numbers. So the more of us who engage in these, you know, for example, the global climate strike tomorrow, I hope that it goes off with, you know, millions of people in the streets peacefully demonstrating and being treated with respect by the authorities.
Well, that's a very inspiring note. I'm just going to give you just two more questions from the audience, and then you've been extremely generous with your time, so we'll let you go after that. The first question is from Orla, and she asks something that we haven't really touched on yet, which is you mentioned that Costa Rica has increasingly amounts of its energy from renewable sources, but you haven't really mentioned nuclear power so far. So should we stay away from nuclear power, or can this help us in the fight against climate change?
Oh, that's a thorny question, but I will say this. I'm not an expert in nuclear power, but I have a colleague at the University of British Columbia who is, and his name is Ramana, Ramana, and he has written extensively about how nuclear does not need to be part of the solution. And that is for two main reasons. One is economics. Right now, today, the cost of renewable energy generation combined with battery storage is less than the cost of new nuclear electricity generation. So when you combine that economic case for renewables with the risk that nuclear energy generates, right the entire supply chain from the mining of uranium, which has caused horrific human rights and environmental damage in places like Canada that I'm familiar with, to the potential accidents at nuclear reactors, which we've seen in Chernobyl, Fukushima, and the United States, to the disposal of nuclear waste, which is not yet, there's not really a solution to that issue, and then to the risk of terrorist actions using nuclear materials. When you combine the economic case for renewables with the high cost and the high risks of nuclear, I believe that we should just you know, I don't think we need to shut down all existing nuclear power plants. We can use them till the end of their safe lifespan. But our emphasis going forward should be absolutely 100% focused on renewable energy, because that is the most economically and environmentally and safe way forward.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and that's a very important issue to bring up. And then just one final question from Catherine, and she asks, what do you think about international fairness in fighting climate crisis? Should industrial countries really move first, changing how we budget, or must all countries act simultaneously, even though they don't share responsibility from, you know, for emissions in the past, as you mentioned about the exploitation of African resources to fund Western economies for the last century?
Well, you know, 30 years ago, I would have said industrialized countries need to move first and act very quickly to address climate change. Today, I would say that industrialized countries still have to make the fastest, deepest reductions, but we also need everybody on board, because we've reached a point where we just cannot continue to burn fossil fuels. We cannot have, and listen, let's be perfectly open about this. There's still more than 1 billion people worldwide who do not have access today to electricity. That's really, I mean, for those of us who live in wealthy nations, it's hard to even imagine life without electricity. Some form of energy needs to be provided to those people so that they can achieve a decent quality of life. So we're going to need more energy, but we cannot provide that energy with fossil fuels. It's simply, the science is crystal clear. The writing is on the wall. We need to move away from fossil fuels. All humanity needs to move away from fossil fuels as quickly as possible. China's announcement yesterday that they will not build new coal-fired power plants in other countries is a huge development. China has been the largest source of new coal-fired power plant financing around the world for years now. That announcement is a huge step forward. We need China to also stop building new coal-fired power plants in China. India faces huge energy challenges, but I think the way that we can actually crack this nut, this difficult challenge, is that industrialized, wealthy countries need to rapidly move away from fossil fuels, and we need to provide the financial assistance to the Indias and the Africas of the world to enable them to build renewable energy systems and provide a decent quality of life for their people. That is going to be a joint effort between the Indias, the Africas, and the wealthy nations. And the wealthy nations really, based on our historical contribution, we need to step up to the plate and do we've made a commitment to provide $100 billion a year in climate finance. We haven't yet fulfilled that commitment. We need to fulfill that commitment, and we need to go beyond it.
Terrific. You've given us so much to think about. I want to thank you very much, Professor Boyd, for such an illuminating address. It has really been, I think, absolutely inspiring. So I'm sure that we could continue to talk for another couple of hours, but we know that you're very busy. So thank you so much for talking with us today and for launching our academy. I also wanted to just say that this has been a very significant moment for the opening of this academy. And I want to thank everybody that has attended, especially all of our students. And in particular, also, I'd like to thank Tamara Takish and all the members of the Centre of Expertise in Global Governance for putting this event together. I also want to thank you, the audience, for joining us and for your very provocative questions. I think reading those, I feel assured that the future of the climate change struggle, at least in The Hague and our surroundings, is in good hands. And certainly you have an incredible grasp of the issues. So we've had a very, very, very interesting range of questions raised here tonight. I believe the students will now begin their project work, which they will conduct until the end of November. And the following month, they will present their outcomes. So we hope to invite you all back for an event to discuss those outcomes then. I just wanted to take one more time to say thank you very much to our guest speaker, Professor Boyd. Thank you to all of you for joining us this evening. And please stay tuned and stay in touch for more from the Academy and from the Centre of Expertise in Global Governance at the Hague University of Applied Sciences. Good evening.